Okay, so let's wrap up chapter 2 here in video part number 3 by actually looking at evolution. Um, as your book points out, evolution is simply defined as change over time, or more specifically, what it really refers to is genetic change over time, or as your book says, kind of more technically, a change in allele frequencies. But basically, all evolution really means, biologically speaking, is that as generations pass, the genetic makeup of a particular species or populations within that species will change. It is important to recognize that evolution is really about the dynamic interaction that exists between a trait and an environment. As Darwin identified and recognized natural selection, the role the environment plays as the selective force in identifying or selecting traits that are beneficial, the important realization that came out of that is you can take the exact same trait and you put it in one environment and it's a benefit, but you change the environment and suddenly that trait is a disadvantage. The classic example are peppered moths in England, where prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of gray lichen on the trees. The peppered moths were naturally, some were grayish in color and some were black in color. The black ones stood out from the lichen. The black ones got eaten by birds more frequently. So within the species of peppered moths, there were few black ones and lots of gray ones because the grays had more natural camouflage. Then the Industrial Revolution came along, coal-fired power plants spewed ash all over the countryside, stained everything black. Suddenly the environment has changed, and now those black individuals within the peppered moth species have an advantage, and over time the number of black peppered moths increases and the number of gray ones decreases because now the gray ones stood out in the environment. So this dynamic interaction is incredibly important. Um, the same thing can be, and really, there's nothing all that particularly controversial about that. I mean, change over time. What's so controversial about that? When you look at natural selection and you look at Darwinian evolution, the same can be said about that. When you really boil it down, Darwin's ideas about natural selection, about evolution through natural selection, can be synthesized in four pretty simple concepts, none of which are particularly controversial. The four concepts are that in any species, there's variation, and that's easy to see. I mean, just look around you. Nobody looks exactly like you do. There's a whole lot of variation in the human species. There's also the second point of Darwin, the second main idea is that there's competition. Generally speaking, any species will produce more individuals than there are resources to support those individuals. So individuals have to compete against one another for access to limited resources, whether it's food, whether it's water, whether it's mates, whether it's shelter. Think about, a good way to illustrate that is to think about what you're doing right now. You're in college. Why? Well, because at some level, you recognize that you're in a competition for a limited resource, and that limited resource is a good job. So you want to do something that gives you an advantage in that competition. You want a trait that gives you an advantage in that competition, and a college degree can be that trait. Granted, we're not talking about a natural environment per se, because now we have human culture at work, but it still illustrates the point pretty well. The third point of Darwin is the idea that there's differential reproductive success. What we mean by that is because some individuals will have traits like those lighter peppered moths before the Industrial Revolution, they had a trait that gave them an advantage over the darker colored peppered moths that stood out from their environment. So the lighter colored peppered moths were likely to survive to reproduce. So what that meant is that in the next generation, there would be more lighter colored peppered moths. So you have differential reproductive success as the third key element of Darwin. And then finally, also illustrated by that same example, is the idea of the genetic alteration of future generations. You have a population that starts off with 50 gray peppered moths and 50 black peppered moths. 20 of the gray peppered moths, but 40 of the black peppered moths get eaten. So now in the next generation, you suddenly have 75 gray peppered moths and only 25 black peppered moths, because fewer black peppered moths survive to reproduce. So you've had a genetic change from one generation to the next, a genetic alteration in future generations. And really, that's all evolution is. Where evolution becomes sort of profound is when we throw in things like um, when we look at the implications of that pattern playing out generation after generation for thousands and millions and then ultimately billions of years. So let's look at an example, and your book uses this example, so I will use it as well, of sickle cell trait. And how does sickle cell trait help us to understand this interaction? And like I said, your book does a pretty good job of describing it. So just real quickly, sickle cell trait, it's important to understand we're talking about sickle cell trait. What that means is you have an individual who, on their gene for hemoglobin, they have an allele for normal hemoglobin, but they also have an allele for sickled hemoglobin. So they have one of each. And what that means is that about 40% of their hemoglobin takes on the sickled shape. And that's important because researchers noticed in the early part of the 20th century that it seemed like the sickle cell trait was found in particular parts of the world. And then they realized that there was a pattern that played out, that where sickle cell trait tended to be, there was also a lot of malaria. So how could there possibly be a link? And what they learned was that malaria is caused by a tiny little bug called the plasmodium that's carried by a mosquito. The mosquito bites you, the plasmodium gets into your bloodstream, and you get malaria. However, if you are a person who is a carrier for sickle cell trait, because 40% of your red blood cells are sickled, that means that the environment of your bloodstream is a hostile environment to the plasmodium. The plasmodium that causes malaria can't thrive there as well, so you have a natural resistance. So what that meant is that in a malarial environment, sickle cell trait is actually a benefit because it gives a person a resistance to malaria. Having all normal hemoglobin makes you vulnerable to malaria. And the insightful thing about that is that we could see how that trait actually changed as the environment changed. Following the Second World War, programs began to eradicate malaria. So swamps were drained and pesticides were sprayed and malarial mosquitoes were killed. And what ended up happening was suddenly sickle cell trait is no longer a benefit in that environment because malaria is gone. Actually, having all normal hemoglobin is beneficial because you don't have the health consequences of having sickle cell trait. So over time, sickle cell trait begins to disappear in these populations. Now here in the 21st century, as malaria has been making a comeback, you're seeing sickle cell trait also begin to make a comeback. So once again, this idea that there's this dynamic interaction. Same trait, different environments. In one environment where it's a benefit, its numbers increase. In another environment where it's not a benefit, its numbers decrease. So beyond illustrating this idea of evolution through natural selection and how it works, sickle cell trait actually does two other important things. First is that it serves as a really good example of how we can, despite claims to the contrary, we can actually observe evolution as it occurs in the human species. And that's important because it becomes a model to help us build frameworks to study other avenues of evolution occurring both in the human species and in other organisms. But there's an even more important idea that sickle cell trait illustrates. when we talk about natural selection or we talk about evolution, we tend to talk about it as if it has intent, or it has a purpose, or it has a goal. Evolution is seen as progress. We talk about natural selection. There's a selective process going on where nature is saying, you are good, this trait is good, this trait is bad, I'm going to pick the good one. The fact of the matter is that we talk about it that way because it helps us to understand it a little bit more, but evolution and natural selection have no intent. There's no purpose. There's no end goal. There's no sense of progress. Think about it this way. 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs went extinct. The extinction of the dinosaurs, that was an evolutionary process. It was change. A pretty significant change in some gene lines since they were completely eradicated. From the perspective of the dinosaurs, I suspect that wasn't a very positive change. That certainly didn't seem like progress to them. However, evolution doesn't care. Natural selection is intentless. It just favors traits that are beneficial in an environment. And if the environment changes and you can't change along with it, so be it. Sorry about your bad luck. The way that sickle cell illustrates this is think about the implications of sickle cell. Oftentimes, natural selection doesn't favor an ideal trait in a particular environment. More often than not, natural selection favors a trait that's just good enough to get by. And sickle cell is a good example of that, because if you're living in a malarial environment, you are more likely to survive to reproduce if you are a carrier for sickle cell. But if we draw the Punnett square and look at what happens when two people who are carriers for sickle cell mate, we'll notice something important. We'll notice that 50% of their children, 50% of their offspring statistically are likely to be carriers for sickle cell. So they will be resistant to malaria, and that's good. But at the same time, it means that 25% of their offspring are likely to have normal hemoglobin. Those people are likely to get malaria, and they are likely to be far less successful in reproducing if they survive at all. Another 25% of their offspring are likely to have sickle cell disease, and they will die without major medical intervention, which isn't often available in many places with malaria. They will die by the time they're between 3 and 5 years old. So natural selection is favoring a trait that, for all intents and purposes, dooms 50% of a mating couple's offspring to either malaria or death. But in the eyes of natural selection, that is good enough. And we will see many other examples as we go along this semester where natural selection has done the same thing, where natural selection has favored a structure or a trait, but it has to compromise because that structure or trait is serving multiple purposes. So it's definitely not an ideal one, but it's good enough to get by. I hope this has provided you with a little bit of insight into how evolution through natural selection works and the importance of that dynamic interaction between environment and trait, which, again, as I've said with so many other things in these videos, will become sort of a core focus of our discussions as we progress through this first half of the text in the biological anthropology section. This completes Chapter 2. The trilogy is complete! Have a good evening, and I will see you in Chapter 3.